Good evening, Grace Bible Church and Friends of Grace. This last Sunday, we were back in the book of Jude, and we covered verses 8 through 10. And this is in the larger section of 8 through 13. But this last week, we began the first part of what I anticipate being two engagements of verses 8 through 13. Now, as we begin, we kind of refresh where we are in the book. So we've seen that we've already covered the introduction and greeting. That was a necessary foundation. And then obviously the call to contend, the very heart and core of the book, that we're to contend for the faith that's been passed on to the saints. And with that, we also had the rationale for the contending, because there are those who have crept into the church. Then the last week, we covered foundations for righteous judgment, that there is not only historic precedent for God righteously judging a people, but specifically the nature of these kind of offenders, that the Lord will deal with them, and he'll deal with them righteously and definitively. And that brought us to now the indictment of the godless invaders, verses 8 through 13, which kind of constitutes the body of the letter, the middle section, as it were. And we talked for a little bit about what the nature of an indictment is. It's basically grounds for accusation. It's affirming the foundations and the rationale and the reasons and the elements to the accusation that's made, so as to lead to the ultimate condemnation, which we will see in the next session, the surety of righteous judgment in verses 14 through 16. And so with that being said, we have in this section here a bracketed engagement. We have the body of the letters framed by judgment passages, a foundation for righteous judgment, the fact that the Lord has and will deal with the people. Now this indictment, or the establishment of guilt, in this middle section that we're in right now. And then after that will come the surety of righteous judgment. And so Jude really kind of frames with precedent and foundations of judgment, the grounds for their being judged, and then the fact that the Lord will indeed fully and finally judge them, as he expresses in those last verses of 14 through 16. And then we'll advance to the second half of the book. And with that, further unpacking how to contend for the faith. Now, we made some general observations in terms of our engagement of this section. We mentioned this last week that we're going to see more and more echoes of Peter in this section. And this was especially clear in verses 8 through 10. You can see, or you can follow in 2 Peter 2, 10 through 12. Like language, like subject matter, blaspheme glorious one, unreasoning animals, blaspheming, destroyed. Things that, again, we've seen in 2 Peter. We've seen how they were developed there. And now we're seeing Jude not just replicate it, but drawing from that, developing it for himself. And a couple of notable things with that, again, are the tenses. They will be destroyed, as Peter stated. Jude now states that they are being destroyed. But also, you can note that Jude fills this section out a little bit more, specifically the blaspheming of glorious ones. And I think there's a good reason for that. I think he wants to make even more plain, more clear the argument where we landed, that this is a blaspheming of fallen angels and how arrogantly foolish that was by these offenders. So then we also noted that as this section began, he starts off with, yet in the same way. He's drawing back. He has verse 8 with a view to verses 5 through 7. And what he's doing here is he's establishing there's a clear association of the character and practices of these men, these who have crept into Christ's church, with those whom the Lord has judged before. And so we noted that verses 5 through 7 does establish the historic precedent and the expression of the character of God as he engages these wicked men throughout history, but also the fact here, with Jude drawing back to it, that it wasn't just historic precedent, but there's also like character qualities or lack of character qualities and practices expressed by these men. And we see that specifically with these shared patterns of sexual immorality, rejecting authority, arrogant ignorance. And again, we paralleled those with each of the examples that he provided in 5 through 7. With sexual immorality, we noted that it was a defilement of the flesh. It made one unfit for worship. And so we could really kind of define that standard of defile on that basis. What is compromising the integrity of one being able to stand in joyful, faithful, righteous worship before the Lord of glory? And chances are there's an expression of defilement there. And this isn't just a passive defilement of struggling with sin and trying to overcome these things. This is an active engagement of defiling the flesh, usually an expression of sexual immorality, which is, again, a consistent pattern with false teachers, false converts, those who have crept in to do the church harm. It's not a definitive element that we're always going to see, but it's quite exceptional when it's not there or ultimately found to have been there. Also, the rejecting of authority. We noted that this can have a very broad range of expression. People struggle with God's design for government, God's design for work, God's design for the home, but also God's design for the church. And I think it's that last one that he has a primary view to because of the nature of they've crept into what institution and what group? Well, the church. They haven't crept into the government. They haven't crept into a workplace. They haven't crept into a family. They've crept into the church. And I think it's in that context that they're especially challenging and rejecting that authority, and specifically the eldership, the pastors, the under shepherds. And so they are challenging those who are most likely to draw attention to their offenses and their sins and produce a measure of correction. Now that's a responsibility of the church body at large, but it's going to be especially plain with the leadership. And also the fact that they likely are going to try to attempt to creep into measures of leadership as well. And then we had the pattern of arrogant ignorance. And this was most plainly expressed in their blaspheming angels or blaspheming glorious ones. And it just shows incredibly how arrogant and just really incredibly ignorant they were in terms of how they're posturing and handling themselves. And then this was all under the umbrella of dreaming. All under the umbrella of dreaming. And so what's the nature of this dreaming? Well, that was something that we discussed, and there's differing opinions and conclusions on this. But we concluded this was dreaming with a view to prophetic visions, but not ones that are sourced in God. So they're claiming to have some kind of authoritative experience, vision, dream, or otherwise, that either was by their own making, or perhaps worse, perhaps from some kind of satanic or demonic influence. We really don't know. We just know that they are attempting to undermine the authority of the scriptures. And that's a major part of what I think that they're doing here in their dreaming these dreams, is they've introduced a new authority structure, a new source to root their conduct in, a source that they would see as potentially allowing and permitting things, or at least excusing. And so we recognize that this is something that we also saw in 2 Peter. If you recall, before Peter addressed the false teachers, what did he do? He established and reaffirmed the authority of the inspired scriptures, the words of the prophets, the testimony of the apostles. Then before he addressed mockers, what did he do? He reestablished the authority of the prophets and the testimony of the apostles. And then at the end of chapter 3, he returns to the inspired scriptures and affirmed that which he has taught, that which Paul has taught, that they are inspired words of God. And so there is a challenging of authority under the pretense of some kind of divine dreams or visions or otherwise. And we said we just established this is something that we are warned about in the New Testament, to examine, to test, and to be on guard. And that's been the testimony throughout redemptive history, even with Old Testament Israel. And then we see that Jude really gives most of his attention to this matter of blaspheming angels. Again, echoing Peter, but filling it out more as we've expressed. But again, you see the blaspheming glorious ones, a blasphemous judgment. These men blaspheme. And so clearly he's drawing attention to something that's of unique consequence and weight to him. And so we gave our primary measure of attention in terms of the three identified offenses. We gave this one the most attention, as I believe was fitting in accordance to what Jude did as well. And again, we see those comparisons with 2 Peter, where it's more filled out here in Jude. And with this, we were reminded that angels, or the glorious ones, are indeed esteemed and powerful creatures. And so this is an important element to establish the nature of their arrogance and these follies and these offenses that they've done, because they're failing to recognize, again, that angels are above man at this point in time until we are in our a resurrected and glorified state. Angels are of superior strength and superior standing. Both, I would argue, holy and fallen angels are unique in a lot of regards. And And again, I know we struggle with how do we categorically understand holy angels versus fallen angels in terms of strength and authority and power, but we have to recognize these are esteemed and glorious creatures, and we would do well to appreciate that, unlike these men who have crept in within the church. Now again, the conclusion, as it was with 2 Peter, and under re-examination and trying to really wrestle through this, I personally have still concluded that these are fallen angels that that Jude is speaking to. Peter spoke to, Jude's now speaking to. Now, that being said, I do think there's a good argument for considering them being holy angels, blaspheming glorious ones. One, by the simple fact that they're referred to as glorious ones. That's a really hard thing to get around, to call a fallen angel glorious. And the way I understand that is, one, their prior condition. They obviously were glorious, reflecting God's glory in a variety of ways, but glory also expresses weight. And I just think that of all creatures, they bear unique weightiness. Even in their fallen condition, they are utterly unique in so many ways. And also, again, though, an argument for the opposing position, it's not really opposing the other position, that, you know what, maybe we're going to wrestle more in years to come and find that, this was a better argument. So I want to present it in fairness. They also would argue that because of the association with the law, that's why they were blaspheming or insulting these glorious ones. And what I mean by the association with the law, we have Deuteronomy 33, Acts 7, Galatians 3, Hebrews 2, all these references to angels in some way, in ways that I don't necessarily fully understand or know to appreciate, is that they mediated or participated in the giving of God's law. So there was a participation in that work of giving of the law and mediating the law. And so with that, you have those who have no regard for the Lord or the things of the Lord or for his law. And so therefore, there goes the argument that they would blaspheme these mediators and these who've participated in having God's law come to God's people. So again, I think there's good arguments for it being holy angels. But that being said, I mentioned it's not the evidence of beyond reasonable doubt, but the preponderance of evidence. So the weight shifted just a little bit more for me, and I think several respected commentators and Bible teachers, that it was fallen angels. And so that being said, I wanted to recognize that's just a hard subject to work through, but I do think it's a blaspheming of fallen angels. And why would they do that? Well, I look at the immediate context of both treatments of 2 Peter and Jude, just as well as the common practice of false teachers. And I see that this is a measure of their arrogance, a measure of their exercising an authority over these supernatural creatures, these powerful creatures. It's easy to speak down against someone else who's wrong and to put them in their place, as it were. It wouldn't make as much sense to someone who's creeping into the church and blaspheming glorious angels. Rather, to demand things of Satan, to demand things of his minions and his other fallen angels. I think that's part of the modus operandi of the false teacher and what we've seen, at least in contemporary expressions of it. But again, also here, that they're attempting to do that which is really beyond their capacity or place. And we developed how to understand that in terms of the radical contrast that I think Jude is really drawing out for us here. I think if he was just saying that it was holy angels, it'd be a very clear argument. That's arrogant, foolish, just obviously wicked. But instead he makes this argument about how Michael engaged Satan, if you're going to blaspheme a fallen angels, that's obviously the most natural one you're going to blaspheme and curse or rebuke would be Satan himself. And yet Jude shows us that as powerful and as glorious as Michael was, he didn't even do that. He didn't even dare to do it. And so again, I think that helps shift the balance for us here. And so with that being said, we looked at the nature and character of Michael, what we know of him, which is not a whole lot, but what we do know is really weighty and clear. So he's a uniquely distinct angel, obviously identified as an archangel, and that's a unique identity even among other supernatural creatures. And we saw in Daniel chapter 10 that he was one of the chief princes among the angels. We saw in Daniel chapter 12 he was a great prince among the angelic realm, and that he, in some form or fashion, was a protector, a caretaker, for Israel, the covenant people of God. And then we see in Revelation chapter 12 that he leads other holy angels and specifically leads them in some form of combat or opposition with Satan and his fallen angels. And by God's authority and power, he overcomes him and casts him down to the earth. And so very, very powerful, consequential angel. And that really sets us up for what Jude states next, specifically that not even Michael, this unique and powerful and glorious supernatural archangel, not even he dared to blaspheme Satan, to denounce him in this way, to do what these who have crept in among Christ's church to do what harm so cavalierly and brazenly do in their own arrogant ignorance. And so again, that shifts the balance of the weight toward them being fallen angels or unholy angels or wicked creatures, as it were. But because in this case, in this scenario, that was exactly what Michael did. He engaged a fallen angel, specifically Satan, and yet he didn't even dare to do what these wicked men are doing. And so it shows the height of their arrogance, the height of their ignorance. And then he continues on. There's a striking contrast to what they truly do and do not understand. And so they would appear to be conducting themselves because they have this wisdom and insight and authoritative power, blaspheming these things, but they don't even have a clue to what they're doing. They're so ignorant in their arrogance and their sin. And because of that, they're blinded as to the foolishness of what they're doing. And really, by striking contrast, what they do prove is not what they know, but really what they don't know. And all that they ultimately know is that they are operating almost like a base instinctual knowledge that you would expect of animals. And so what kind of based instinctual knowledge would you expect of animals? Well, they got to eat. And so an animal's driven to eat. An animal's driven to procreation, to continue to reproduce its own kind. An animal's designed or naturally knowledgeable about fighting or at least fleeing from threats. That's kind of the base knowledge, and that's what these arrogant, ignorant people are demonstrating. Just this in a carnal form of it, because it's a fallen condition. And so, yes, they're going to make sure they're sustained and they're cared for and they're protected, but also even the form of procreation, we would argue that falls back into their sexual immorality and their indifference and their selfishness. And so, and in such matters, Jude states they will be destroyed. So they've purported to have this authority, this insight and ability, which really just betrays how arrogantly foolish they are, and that truthfully their knowledge is limited to this base carnal expression of life. And then with this, we provided really just a humble contrast of the righteous. And we saw that with, we've been working through Psalm 119 for several weeks, and we will continue working through it for several weeks ahead. And as we've tracked through it, we've seen the psalmist express various petitions, and there's a large consistency to some of these petitions, especially as they center around the scriptures. Things like, Lord, teach me, Lord, open my eyes, help me understand. And with this, Lord, keep me pure, holy, and humble. That's the disposition of the righteous. And so, as we've said before, it's just a matter of time before those who've crept in among Christ's church become quite obvious. You look at the fruit that the righteous are bearing and those who have crept in are bearing. And so the fruit of the righteous is this humble disposition, this recognition, Lord, please help me. Lord, open my eyes to your word. I love your word. I want to be holy. I want to be pure, which stands in direct contrast to the nature of the character and conduct of those who have crept in among us, and hence the indictment that Jude's able to present. He's able to draw from, this is their character and conduct in ways that they are sexually immoral, that they have no regard for authority, and that they blaspheme glorious ones, expressing the height of their arrogant ignorance. Now, we did discuss Jude's use of extra-biblical sources here and the nature of the event he spoke to. It was very unique in terms of sourcing a pseudeographical extra-biblical source, but we spoke to inasmuch as he cited it and cited it as authoritative and credible, that he cited was authoritative and credible. That does not extend that to all of that particular resource, something that we had to work through. We also spoke to how there's precedent for how Michael did what later was expressed because of historic timing here in Zechariah chapter 3, verses 1 to 2, in terms of how Satan was addressed in another point in time in which he was accusing God's man, Joshua the high priest, who also stood kind of as a representation of Israel in that moment, and how, again, this wasn't in the same form or fashion as these arrogant unbelievers. And so we work through that. I would encourage you to give attention to the fuller message in terms of some of those details if that's of interest to you, but also just to refresh yourself. Now, that being said, this was a tighter focus this week, verses 8 through 10, on the indictment of the ungodly, those who have crept in among us, centering on those three characteristics. Again, sexual immorality, the rejection of authority, and blaspheming glorious ones, with the greatest effort and focus being on the blaspheming of glorious ones because of the attention Jude gave it. And it just, again, it gives us a real clear insight into the nature of their character and ways. But that being said, let's consider some ways that we can be praying in response. First, I would encourage us that pray that we would maintain a pattern of purity, submission, and humility. Again, it's not that we posture ourselves just to be in a response to those who have crept in among us, but this is to be our identity, to be ones of purity and submission to the range of authorities the Lord's placed over us, to include the authority structures in the church. And that doesn't mean that the pastors have the right to lord ourselves over others. The pastoral office has its authority by design restricted to the authority the scriptures express. And so inasmuch as we teach and exhort and proclaim and rebuke in accordance to the scriptures, that's as far as that authority goes. And it's an authority of one as an under shepherd. It's a stand-in for the Lord himself, who is the chief shepherd and to whom they will give an account. So there is an authority structure the Lord's provided, but it's to be one of humble service to the body, and it should be submitted to accordingly, something that a false teacher and those who have crept in are especially going to resist. And then just to maintain humility. We may not pursue the forms and heights of arrogant ignorance that such persons do, but we are prone to any number of expressions of a lack of humility, and we need to pray the Lord's grace to keep us in that. Pray that we would stay rooted in the authority of the scriptures and not be drawn away by lesser things that would appear to speak to the moment or undermine God's word. There's any number of things that would seek to be insightful or dynamically helpful. We've just got to be faithful to make sure the clear authority, not just in the testimony of our words, but in the truth of our practice, is the Word of God. That we're not looking to visions and dreams or gimmicky things or the next great thing that comes out by book or conference, podcast, or otherwise, that we're always walking and restricting ourselves to the authority of the Scriptures. And in as much as other things express that, develop it, put it to application, that's wonderful, but we have to restrain the parameters of true authority to the Scriptures. Pray that we would maintain a consistent disposition of prayer that expresses our need for God to teach us, open our eyes, and help us understand His Word. That's, again, what the psalmist has modeled for us over and over again. And I think I know that's a wise and a good practice. Lord, teach me, help me, open my eyes. I want to understand. And that constant expression of dependence upon the Spirit of God to be our teacher. And then finally, pray that we would have wisdom in contending well in a manner consistent with what the Lord has plainly instructed, and not in some arrogantly ignorant manner. We are called to contend. And as I mentioned at the end of the message, it can be challenging to understand, because here we're called to contend to not blaspheme glorious ones, and yet we're told that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, and yet we know the pattern and model is that we are often contending with people, and yet it's a spiritual. How do we understand that? We're going to have to wrestle through that, and ultimately I think we have a pretty good idea that it's usually the common practices of walking in joyful, faithful obedience and holy and righteous lives, and speaking truth and opposing those who fail to do so or who would distort truth. That there is a very common but also spiritual expression of that. And we're going to work through that, Lord willing, more this next Sunday. But we need to wrestle through how to contend well, especially in view of God's character revealed and righteously judging those who had crept in, the indictment that He's presented, and as the indictment continues to grow, and then again leads to future judgment as well. And then finally, as we work through the book, we're going to see more precise and clear ways that we'll contend as well. All right, so this Wednesday, if you're able to join us, we would encourage you. We will continue giving our attention, as I mentioned, to Psalm 119. We're going to be in verses 73 through 80 this next Wednesday, tomorrow evening, and giving time and attention to prayer as well. And then, Lord willing, we'll continue Jude 1, 8 through 13 with our primary attention on 11 through 13. But again, I'm going to attempt to craft and present a case for how to contend in view of this response to this arrogant disposition of contending against spiritual matters in an improper way. So how do we do that well? And then we'll finish out, Lord willing, 11 through 13. All right. Well, I hope this is of benefit to you as you continue to struggle and think through the book of Jude, and specifically the call to contend for the faith. And Lord willing, we will be found faithful. All right, grace and peace to you all.